Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the January meeting of the Boston chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Tonight we have with us Phil Warburg, who's going to speak to us about the green illusion, the pitfalls of electrifying an automotive status quo. Phil is a senior fellow at BU's Institute for Sustainable Energy. He served as president and CEO of the Conservation Law Foundation from 2003 to 2009, and during the height of the battle over Cape Wind, and previously led Israel's leading environmental advocacy group, the Israel Union for Environmental Defense. In addition to writing numerous articles on energy policy, he's also the author of Harvest the Wind, America's Journey to Jobs, Energy Independence, and Climate Stability, and also Harness the Sun, America's Quest for a Solar-Powered Future. So welcome, Phil. We're interested in your comments tonight.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here with you, so to speak. Well, we all know that transportation has edged out. Electricity is the #1 source of US greenhouse gas emissions, and that's largely thanks to the decline of coal and the rise in renewable energy for power generation. So transportation is a mere 1% above electricity generation as a source of greenhouse gas emissions, but it makes it prominent in the agenda of people who are serious about addressing climate change. The Transportation and Climate Initiative, which you're all familiar with to some degree, I imagine, is an important means of reining in greenhouse gas emissions in the Northeast. But its geographical reach is limited to 3 relatively small New England states, plus the District of Columbia. Hopefully additional states will sign on, but the Transportation and Climate Initiative is no standalone in addressing the challenge of reducing the carbon footprint of our transportation sector. We need to revamp the federal standards that have quite literally created automotive monsters like the one you saw on the opening slide of this presentation, an all-electric Hummer with 1,000 horsepower. In his campaign, now President Biden, thankfully, spoke nostalgically about reforms to the corporate average fuel economy standards that he helped bring about during the Obama years. During the campaign, he repeatedly promised to reverse the setbacks that CAFE had suffered under Trump. I'd like to talk about why restoring Obama's CAFE standards is not good enough. CAFE's origins, as you all know, I'm sure, date back to the mid-70s, to 1975 to be precise, when there were long gas lines and high gasoline prices. Greenhouse gas emissions were barely a thought, and the focus was really on promoting US energy independence. Under CAFE, a double standard was introduced, one for cars, another more lenient one for light trucks. Light trucks were defined as pickup trucks and vans and SUVs, vehicles that either were trucks or had certain characteristics that were similar to trucks. At the time, that may not have seemed like a big deal because pickups were really a very small part of the fleet, and they were primarily used by people who actually needed them. SUVs were hardly heard of. The term, in fact, was first used in a 1974 ad for the Jeep Cherokee. But as the economy prospered and oil prices dropped, successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, left the bifurcated CAFE standards more or less unchanged. As you can see from this chart, for more than 20 years, the standard for cars held steady at 27.5 miles per gallon, and trucks lagged substantially behind. Predictably, auto manufacturers took advantage of the regulatory leeway that this gave to light trucks. This graph tells an important story. The shades of green represent light trucks, as in pickups, vans, and SUVs, and the gray represents passenger cars. In 1975, light trucks accounted for less than 1/5 of new vehicle sales. By 2008, nearly half of all new motor vehicles were light trucks. And by the end of the Obama administration in 2016, 61% of all new motor vehicles were light trucks. The growth continued beyond what you see on this graph, to 72% of the market being taken by light trucks in 2019, and 77% of the market taken by light trucks in April of this year. This graph is also telling an important story. It shows the overall number of light trucks sold per year since CAFE was adopted. That number went from 2 million light trucks sold in 1975 to more than 12 million sold in 2018, with a dip, as you can see, for the 2008 recession. So what happened to CAFE under Obama? Well, there were two good and two not so good things. On the positive side, mileage standards were paired for the first time with corresponding limits on greenhouse gas emissions. And this was thanks largely to the Supreme Court's ruling in the Massachusetts versus EPA case, which gave the EPA power to regulate greenhouse gas emissions as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. The Obama administration set what sounded like a really great target, a fleet-wide target of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. That corresponded with 163 grams of CO2 equivalent per mile emissions. The problem was that this was a target. It was not a mandate. And it was based upon unduly optimistic assumptions regarding where manufacturers and dealers would be putting their advertising dollars and what choices consumers would be making. So on the negative side, the Obama rule kept the dual standard for cars and trucks intact. And in many ways, it made it worse. It introduced what's called the footprint metric for both cars and trucks. This metric set graduated standards for cars and trucks of different sizes. So the bigger the car or the bigger the truck, the more lenient the standard. Cars were already getting bigger, as you can see from this graph showing the Toyota Highlander, the Chevy Tahoe, and the Ford Expedition. But that growth continued. And it wasn't just that the vehicles were getting bigger. It was, again, that the market share for light trucks continued to grow. In December of 2018, Jim Hackett, the Ford CEO, projected that 90% of Ford's 2020 model year sales would be pickups and SUVs. And in fact, if he had decided that 100% of Ford's output would be F-150 or F-350 trucks, he could have done that perfectly legally under the CAFE standards as they exist. GM announced similar plans, killing off various sedans, including the Chevy Cruze, and is moving quickly toward, again, an all-truck or a nearly all-truck fleet. This was amply apparent to me when I attended the North American International Auto Show in Detroit in January of 2019. Passenger vehicles, sedans were nowhere to be seen, really. And what were featured were vehicles like the ones you see here. The four-door truck, which is really the kind of the new station wagon in rural America, and the GMC Denali, a giant SUV, another version of what we used to call a station wagon, but a much more, much heavier and much more gas intensive vehicle. So where are we today? President Biden speaks glowingly about moving America toward an all-electric transportation future. He also embraces a goal of building a 100% clean energy economy by 2050. These are laudable goals, but the transition to electric vehicles will take decades. So internal combustion engines will be with us for the foreseeable future. And even if auto manufacturers electrify the giants now rolling off our production lines, the added power load from those vehicles will make it that much harder to bring about the shift to renewable energy and to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. It makes a big difference whether we electrify cars that look like this or this. I like to call this the 6,000-pound cup of coffee. The bottom line is that we need reforms that will reshape our motor vehicle fleets and not simply electrify the oversized status quo. So that's what I wanted to present, and I'm happy to hear some questions, comments. I think now I take off, let's say stop share, correct? Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Phil, I'll start off with a comment, with a question.
Yeah.
I frequently hear that, if we were to electrify everything, we'll be able to bring down the amount of overall power that we use throughout the economy. Is that correct?
No, it's the opposite. There's a study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that provides different scenarios for electrification. And if we substantially electrify our motor vehicle fleet and shift substantially toward all electric buildings, which will be a gradual process, NREL estimates that by 2050, we will have over 60% growth in our overall electricity demand nationwide. So I think we have to assume that we're going to see a growing electricity sector. And that's the challenge, because even if we hold power production, power consumption stable, we are not really getting all that far in making the shift toward renewable energy. Solar today, I think, is something like 2.5 to 3% of our total power supply, and wind is around 7%. So if we're talking about really ramping up those technologies to meet, let's say, 80% of our total power load, we've got a very long way to go. And this is where, again, I feel that we have to look hard at the kinds of motor vehicles that we're electrifying. If we're electrifying a Hummer that weighs 8,000 pounds with its heavy battery pack, or a Tahoe, same kind of idea, as opposed to a smaller, leaner, meaner vehicle, we're going to be adding very substantially to the power that we need to draw from the grid. And again, this, I think, is derived from our incredibly permissive history with the CAFE standards that have allowed SUVs and trucks to dominate the market. So I think what we need to do, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. A lot of the things that we wish would happen don't necessarily happen, but we should really have a unified motor vehicle fuel economy and greenhouse gas emission standard that every automotive producer has to meet. Therefore, Ford would have to produce some fuel sipping sedans as well as gas guzzling giants like the F-150 and the Ford Expedition. I think we have to move in that direction. Very few people are actually talking about that. And again, under Obama, unfortunately, the problem was really made worse, because what happened with the footprint standard was the manufacturers would grow their cars slightly so that they could bump up into the next fuel standard stratum, thereby having more lenient standards that they would have to meet. So we are so far from the Obama target of 54.5 miles per gallon that it's not even worth talking about.
Do you see a need for, just like we have the CAFE standards basically for liquid fuel, a need for some sort of efficiency standard for the fleet, for the electric fleet?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the best way to make the electric fleet more efficient is to lighten the load. Again, if you're driving around in a, not that everyone is going to buy a Chevy Bolt, but if you're driving around in a 3,500 pound or 3,800 pound Chevy Bolt, as opposed to a 700 or or 8,000-pound Hummer or full-size Ford SUV, you're talking about a very, very different electric load. And I think that size matters, weight matters, and batteries are very heavy. So if you're going to put a battery into a car like the Hummer that I showed in my first slide, that is going to give it 1,000 horsepower and is going to let it drive 300 miles, let's say, without having to get recharged, you're talking about a very large battery, which is going to weigh literally thousands of pounds.
Bill, I just had a quick follow-up question on that. How do you calculate a fleet-wide average fuel economy? Is that just like the average of all the cars that are released by that company in that year?
Well, that was the problem with Obama. He was projecting that a certain number of cars would be bought in the different categories, in each of those footprint classes. And he was way off because gasoline prices got very cheap and people started feeling, well, gee, I guess might as well buy this larger, more comfortable car because I'm going to enjoy it more, and the gas is half the price that it was, 8 years ago. So having a single fleet-wide standard is different than having a single fleet-wide target. And the Obama rule did not come close, unfortunately, to setting a standard in that regard.
It sounds like a really perverse incentive that as you make the cars bigger, you get more leeway on their fuel efficiency. This is really backwards way of doing this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, how would, what do you think would be the best way of, like, who do we pressure to change this? Like, who's in charge of this? Like the EPA or the whatever?
Well, because CAFE is both fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions, these standards were co-developed by the Department of Transportation and the EPA. So one thing I plan to do, frankly, is harangue Pete Buttigieg, who is the incoming Secretary of Transportation, on this issue, and also see if I can get some interest going within the EPA. Unfortunately, Gina McCarthy, who is generally a really laudable environmental figure, was instrumental to the adoption of the CAFE standard reforms under Obama. And when I posed the question to her in this regard in a public forum at one point, her answer was a kind of mumbling, well, we have the unions that we have to worry about. There was not a clear response of, no, this is really the right way to go in terms of the environment. And I think what we've got to do is get serious about thinking about the environment when we think about these standards and reforming these standards. The good news is that Biden has repeatedly said he wants to reform the deteriorated standards under Donald Trump. So if there is movement, at least then there's room for negotiation. It's not opening up a Pandora's box because they want to open that box.
We have time for one more question if anybody has one.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I was just curious in terms of you're talking about electric load, and now that transportation has just passed as the #1 greenhouse emitter, I was just wondering, is there? I guess two-part question. One is there? What part of the transportation sector is like trucks or commercial versus personal car use? And second is, I guess, what do you envision for trucking, basically around the United States, being able to convert to electrical trucks eventually?
Yeah, I don't have an exact number on that. I'd love to pull one up, actually. Cars make up the lion's share of the automotive fuel burned, but a lot of the carbon emissions do come from trucks because trucks are relatively polluting. Charging a truck is going to take, and when you think about, again, the load, if you're going to be charging up millions of long distance haul trucks, it's one thing to charge up city delivery vehicles. It's another to charge up long haul trucks. You're going to have to require huge electric charging capacity. We're not talking about a Tesla charger. We're talking about much, much bigger chargers. I think it's certainly technologically feasible. It will come at considerable cost, and truckers are probably going to be pretty resistant because it will take time for them to charge up these vehicles, and they tend to drive for multiple hours. So if they're going to be driving 400 miles a day, let's say 500 miles a day, they're going to have to stop in the middle of the day to charge. And unless they've got some incredible development in terms of supercharging vehicles, it's going to cut into their time considerably.
Okay. Well, Phil, we really appreciate your stopping by, as it were.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. And, like you, in fact, I think this conversation and invitation came about because of your letter to the editor in the New York Times.
Oh, okay.
And in Citizens Climate Lobby, we write a lot of letters to the editor. So we'll be watching for your stories and your activities, and hopefully supporting you with some letters to the editor in the near future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me.
Sure. Thanks for coming.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.